I'm going to start straight up at 12, at 11:30, our accepted time. Okay, good day, everyone, and welcome to the GSA webinar, The Economics of a Longevity Dividend. My name is George Taff, and I'm the moderator of today's webinar. I'm a professor at Baylor College of Medicine in geriatrics and cardiovascular research, and I'm the head of geriatrics at Houston Methodist Hospital. But today I serve as the chair of GSA's Public Policy Advisory Committee, and the Public Policy Advisory Committee provides information to the GSA board and to the staff to support public initiatives of the society, including the annual meeting and the policy series there. It also, we also provide topics for consideration to the Public Policy and Aging Report editorial board and concepts for briefing and for webinars just like this. Next slide, please, Karen. So before we start, we have a couple of housekeeping items to go through, but first, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to see who's here and find out who's interested in this. We will be using the chat box to pick questions through today's webinar. We won't interrupt the speaker, Dr. Scott, to ask him questions, but we will have all that at the end. And we'll ask you while the webinar is ongoing to keep your video off and your audio on mute until it's time for discussions. And again, the question and answer will be right after the live presentation. Next slide, Karen. So it's my pleasure to present our speaker today. He's Dr. Andrew J. Scott. He's a professor of economics at the London Business School, a consulting scholar at the Stanford University Center on Longevity, a research fellow at the Center for the Economic Policy, and he's a co-author of what brought into our attention in 2021, the economic value of targeting aging. In today's webinar, we'll be taking a closer look and a broader look at some of the implications of altering the aging process. More specifically, we've been focusing on extending biological and healthy aging, and how does that impact health scientists, economics, all of us personally, and everyone in between. Is it preferable to make us healthier and compress morbidity, or to make our lives longer, and all the other choices? And I just have to say, Dr. Scott in that paper set things up beautifully and very clearly. So without further delay, I'll hand the microphone and the screen to Dr. Scott. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very much an economist, but I can think of few topics more multi and interdisciplinary than longevity. So I really appreciated the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to sharing my thoughts, but also learning from you. Before I do that, I have to try and share my slides, which of course have just disappeared, but let me just quickly try and get them back up again. There we go. It works seamlessly beforehand, and of course, when we're working live, it doesn't. But here we go. Hopefully you can see my slides. So the title of The Economics of a Longevity Dividend is taken from a research grant I have in the UK called Investigating the Economics of a Longevity Dividend. And I guess if I can just begin with kind of what got me into this topic as a macroeconomist. And most of my career has been spent focusing on interest rates and fiscal policy and business cycles, all the stuff we're reading about in the newspapers today. But to be honest, I got kind of bored with that, and I've always been interested in bigger trends. And I used to give a talk about an aging society as part of a world economy course. And this is a chart you'll be achingly familiar with. It's United Nations data on the world population. And you see, there's two things happening: this huge increase in the world population from 1950 to today, which is projected to continue, but also an aging society. And the way the aging society is normally conceptualized, you draw a horizontal line across, say at 60 years, and you say, wow, look, there's a load more older people, both in terms of billions, but also as a percentage of the population. We have an aging society. And that aging society very much focuses on a change in the age structure of the population. I actually think, not that that's not unimportant, I think it's a very incomplete way of looking at things. And my perspective is very much to sort of look vertically, to draw a line going up and say, well, the big change has happened is the young can now expect to become the old, and actually the very old, and the middle age can expect to become the old and the very old. So it's really about longevity. It's about having a longer life and more time ahead of us. And that requires change, both in terms of science and medicine, but also in terms of our behavior. Because if you have more time ahead of you and expectation, then you need to behave differently. You need to invest in your future more. You need to change your behavior. We need to change how we age. So if an aging society is around changes in the age structure of the population, I think longevity is about changing how we age. So that's very much my agenda. And just to sort of make the point that to me, this is the most fundamental change that's happened. I've chosen Sweden because the data goes back a long time. These are survival rates for a newborn in Sweden in 1751 and various other years. And you can see these survival rates which show the probability of a newborn living to different ages. And the area under each survival curve is actually life expectancy. So life expectancy has been increasing, but you can see particularly the more recent shifts, it's a longevity transition. The probability of reaching to 80 or to 90 is now above 50%. And that's remarkable. That's not something we've ever had to do before, to think, oh, the young will become the old. And it's that longer term perspective that I like to focus on. Now, the aging society tends to focus on old and end of life, but longevity, of course, is about doing things differently across the life course. And here I just put some facts in to show that that is happening in the UK, just even over the last 30 years. People are getting more education early on. They're having children later on, their first child later on. In the UK, you're now more likely to have a child if you're in your 40s than if you're under 20, which has never been the case before. People are getting divorced later, they're working later. So we are changing how we age. And obviously there's many things behind this, but I think longevity is one of them. So given these longer lives, I think we have to achieve a three-dimensional longevity dividend. We've already got these longer lives given what's been happening to mortality. We've got to make sure they're healthier and also they're productive for longer. And I realize as an economist, I'm going to zoom in on a particular aspect of productivity, but really this is about just recognizing the capacity of people in their older years across the life course, which at least in my country more recently has been grossly underestimated. So how do we achieve this three-dimensional longevity dividend? And again, this focus on changes in how we age, I think is key. Forgive me, I'm going to show you some economics data now. This is UK data, but it will be, the message I'm giving is by no means restricted to the UK. So the blue line here, the axis on the left, shows you the growth in the economy, GDP growth. And the gray line shows you the old age dependency ratio, that rather unpleasant concept that measures the number of people aged over 65 as a proportion of the population. And what I think is remarkable about this is if you, look at what's happened, I don't know of a single economic history book that says a major driver of economic growth in the UK over the last 100 years has been the fact that the old age dependency ratio has risen from 8% to 30%. Not a single study says that. But if you look forward, the number is expected to go from 30 to 45%, and everyone always says this is going to have a terrible effect on the economy. But going from 8 to 30, a bigger increase, both in absolute and proportional terms, hasn't seemed to have an effect on the economy, but we fixate that it's going to have an effect in the future. And of course, this is just going back to Auguste Comte's point, demography is not destiny. There's lots of things we can do, changing how we age, changing the environment, that can bring about this longevity dividend. And before I get on to the economic targeting of aging, just sort of one more example of this from a recent paper I've written with Darren Asamoglu and Nikolai Morbach, which is looking at the nature of work, of occupations. And occupations have become more age-friendly, less physical, more flexible, more autonomy about timing. And this shows you, if you look at the red lines, they're a lot higher than the blue lines to the top right. There's many more jobs now that are more age-friendly. And that has been part of the reason why we've seen this extraordinary increase in employment across the world. at older ages. And in fact, something that I think is not appreciated enough as amongst policymakers, and I'm very keen to get ministries of finance and central banks interested in this agenda, is just how much of employment growth is coming from older workers. This here shows you the proportion of employment growth in the 10 years before COVID has come about from workers aged over 55. And amongst the 7 largest industrialized nations, it accounts for 100% of employment growth. Employment growth is the main driver of GDP growth. The main driver of employment growth is rising employment amongst older people. This is a really important part of what I'll call an economic longevity dividend. But I'm here mainly to talk about this paper, The Economic Value of Targeting Aging. It was published in Nature Aging in 2021. And there's a follow-up coming out in an edited volume, which sort of extends it and makes it a bit more international. And it might be just worth a little bit saying why I was keen to write this paper. So in 2016, I wrote a book called The 100-Year Life. It was spring out from some lectures I was doing at the business school. And it's proved remarkably successful, which is wonderful. But it got me out and about talking to a very different bunch of people than I were used to talk to. Central bankers, ministries of finance, financial market people. And it was wonderful learning about longevity and health and meeting people such as yourself and really learning a huge amount more. And then having sort of, learnt more and thought more and devoted my research to this area, I was keen then to try and make a difference on policy. And for me, that's about going back to the people with like central banks and Ministry of Finance who have huge budgets and getting them interested. But they're very much taken by an aging society story, which is about medical costs, expenditure, not investment, as things being a negative. So I want to try and think, how could we use economic tools to make a case for how important it was to achieve healthy aging, to achieve a longevity dividend, and start to cast it more as a positive, but also in monetary terms to try and get the ear of central banks and ministries of finance. Martin Ellison, a professor of economics, someone I've written about in the past, and David Sinclair at Harvard Medical School, we had conversations, and that's the origins of this particular paper. But before I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail to try and explain it, because I know it's got a lot of attention, and I'm keen to get people to understand exactly what it says. But there are 3 economic ways of approaching this issue of how valuable is it to improve how we age. And before I go through those 3, I mean, obviously, many people just say it's just important, we know it. And I'm very sympathetic to that line. I just know, though, when I talk to ministers of finance, they do tend to like dollar numbers because there's lots of things that are important and they have to then decide between. But there are 3 different ways you could try and justify improving healthy aging to a Ministry of Finance perspective. One is, what is the impact on GDP? Does it give us more GDP? Now, GDP is important. It's not the most important thing. In fact, what comes out clearly from my research is a better indicator of success for a country would be something like healthy life expectancy. But GDP is important. It's about income, and we need income if we're going to invest in health, etc. So we know GDP matters. But I think at the moment in economics, we're way off trying to come up with a credible number about how improving how we age would affect GDP. And I think that's reflected in economics. We don't actually have very good models of aging. We really, at best, we just have health as a function, as the thing that makes us age. But we don't really have anything about the passage of time, how people change their behavior as they get older. And if you think about how, if we live longer and age better, the economic impact goes through many different channels, say lifelong learning, for instance, or investing in our health so we can work for longer. What's going to happen to employment? What's going to happen to innovation? And we just aren't in a situation where I think we have good enough models to come up with an answer to what does healthy aging do for GDP? I'm working on it, but it's going to take a while. The second way of thinking about putting a dollar value on the gains from healthy aging, and I come across this an awful lot in the health sector and with health economists, is to say, well, if we age better, we'll spend less money on dementia or arthritis or on care homes, all of which is absolutely right and will be an important way of capturing the ear of ministries of finance, etc. But personally, I worry about that as an approach. And the reason I worry about it is that, let's imagine I had a magic wand and I could eliminate dementia. What a wonderful magic wand that would be. But it was an expensive magic wand and it cost twice as much as we currently spend on dementia care. I would still think that would be a fantastic investment. That would be absolutely something we should do, even if it comes to be more expensive than what we currently do. So I'm a little bit nervous about justifying healthier aging and measures that promote healthy aging by saving costs, because if it's expensive, I still think we want to do it. And the work I'm going to go through will show you exactly why it's so valuable to age better. So the approach that I'm going to explain to you now is a sort of using standard economic health tools in a slightly non-standard setting to say, well, let's just put a value on how we benefit from better health. Let's use the standard economic tools to put a dollar value on better health. So that's it. It's not about raising GDP. It's not about saving medical costs. It's simply how much is this worth to us? And, Oscar Wilde once said, the cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Economists are very, very good at putting prices on things. And I'm going to go through the standard tools often used in health economics to say, right, this intervention saves this many life years, and it's worth this much to the government. This then is how we allocate health expenditure. Now, there are previous work in this area. There's a great paper by Dana Goldman and Jack Rowe, which uses the HRS, the Health and Retirement Study, as empirically driven and says, well, if we could age better, and they look at a case of raising life expectancy by slightly more than 2 years, it's worth just over $7 trillion. There's an empirical approach, as is more theoretical, so we can look at a lot broader range of things. And they also just put a dollar value on the QALYs, the quality adjusted life years gained. They just assume a number. We're going to derive a number. Because the approach that we used is based on a concept called the value of statistical life. I will try and briefly explain this in a moment. It's the value of statistical life and something called the willingness to pay. So I'll explain the VSL, the value of statistical life, in a moment. But what I want you to think of, let's imagine one life which is expressed as a function of your life expectancy, your survival rates, and your health at different ages. And then imagine a world that's different, where you live longer perhaps, or your health is better at different ages. That will give you a new value of a statistical life. And the willingness to pay is simply the difference between those two, how you value those two different life courses. So we're going to come up with a willingness to pay. How much is an improvement in life expectancy or an improvement in health worth? And we're going to use some economic machinery to work out what that willingness to pay is. Now, of course, to put a dollar value on anything, you have to make a whole bunch of assumptions. So there's lots of steps along the way that people may object to and dislike, and I'll try and be open about that. And I also think there's scope for this methodology to be improved, and I'll talk about that later as well. But let me just tell you a little bit more about the value of a statistical life. And it is a statistical life. So the standard motivation would be something like in road transport. If you're prepared to spend $10,000 on a safety feature that reduces your risk of dying by 1%, then the value of a statistical life is at 10,000 times 100. Because if it's 10,000 for 1%, then 100% is a whole statistical life. So it's 100 times the 10,000. So your VSL would be $1 million. So this VSL approach, this willingness to pay approach, developed by Viscusi in particular, is used in the US government, in the Environmental Protection Agency, road safety, and also in health issues. It was, for instance, used to evaluate the shutdowns that happened during COVID. Now, this looks a horrific screen, but please don't worry about it. I'm just sort of doing this for a number of reasons. The first is just sort of telling you there's some intellectual muscularity behind this, but that's not the real reason. The point is we have to make lots of assumptions, and you can quibble over the assumptions. And I think that's important because I'm going to come up with some dollar numbers, which are huge, and I think that makes sense. But actually, much of the argument in the paper, I think, is more about the mechanisms rather than the dollar numbers, and I'll try and make that clear. But the thing to look at are these two charts here, because they're the key ones. This is the survival rate that we saw a little bit earlier for Sweden, the probability of a newborn reaching certain ages, and we're going to play around with that. We're going to increase it so people can live longer. And then there's a health function which shows your functional capacity, your health capacity, and it's declining with age, and we're going to play around with that. And when I say play around, we're going to base ourselves on US data. So we're going to calibrate a health schedule for the average American, if such a thing exists, and the same with survival rate. And then we're just going to see what would happen if we shifted it. But a really important part of this model, and where I think this sort of goes beyond the normal approach of QALYs and just adding a dollar per QALY style, is that we've got an individual who, when you give them a different length of life or different health, they make different decisions. And that's really important because they're going to adjust when you give them longer lives. They're going to do things differently. And of course, economics is all about trade-offs, and there's lots and lots of trade-offs in this paper here. So if you take the case of just living longer, but in diminishing health, there's going to be lots of things to trade off. One is I've got more time, I'm living longer, and time is a positive in this model. But also the years are coming in declining health, and that's not such a good thing. But also I've got to finance those extra years. If I don't work anymore and I'm living for longer, I'm going to have to spread my money more thinly across all the years. So I'm going to gain from having some more time, but I'm going to lose because my standard of living will be less the rest of the time. So I'm probably going to work some more. So I'll choose to work for longer. If you like, we're going to carry on working after the state pension age, or however you want to conceptualize it. And of course, that means I get less leisure in my lifetime, which is a negative. So we've got agents making these choices and responding, and they're trading off all these different pros and cons. And so we can then sort of make sure that we see how their behavior changes, which changes the value of these incremental increases. Forgive me if that was too quick, but I want to try and get on intuitively now to explain some of the results. I tried to just tell a little bit about the methodology. As I said earlier, lots of assumptions. We calibrate the model to the US. Different assumptions will give different answers. I'll show some international data later. We use a sort of canonical version of a model by Murphy and Topel, which came out in the Journal of Political Economy in 2006. But I think there's plenty of scopes to build on this model, and we can discuss that later. And then, of course, it's a model. So as I say, so different assumptions give different results, which, of course, is the strength of a model, because if different assumptions gave the same results, there's no model, you're just a statement of belief. Now, as I hope that's made clear, it's quite theoretical, but of course, you're making assumptions about things that have an intuitive understanding. And to try and to think about healthy aging, we looked at 4 different literary scenarios. So the Strudberg one, which I'll explain in a moment, taken from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Dorian Gray from Oscar Wilde's novella of the same name, Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie's play, and then a slightly more modern version, which is from the Marvel comics of Wolverine. And each of these 4 different scenarios are different ways of aging better, or of aging more healthily. And because they're different, you get a little bit of bite in terms of which one is going to be more valuable, because they are different. But also you start to see some of the logic of what I think makes healthy aging not just incredibly valuable, but something really quite unique in human history. So I'm going to go through these 4 cases, and we've probably gone through the hardest stuff now. So hopefully this is going to be a little bit more intuitive. He says, putting up this slide. So this is the Strudberg one. So in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the Strudbergs live in the island of Lugnag, which he places somewhere near Japan, which of course has the highest life expectancy at the moment. And it's an interesting one because, you know, I talked earlier about the aging society and this changing structure of the age population. And for me, that's often a very negative story. And which just shows you sort of the ageism we have in our mind. But it's always about decline, decay. And that's very much what Swift does with the Strudbergs. In the island of Luggnagg, there are people like you and I who age as humans do. And then there's the Strudbergs who have a red dot on their forehead, and they age like you and I, but they live forever. And they therefore dread getting old. And Swift really goes to town about how terrible this is, both individually and how poisonous it is for society. You take all the wealth away from older people because otherwise they control society and the economy. He really is very, very negative. And in terms of the sort of model we've got, the Strudberg model does one thing only: it changes your survival rate. So I've got a drawing here. Blue is the original survival rate. That's based on current US data. This is the orange line shows you your health as a function of age. That isn't based on US data in this diagram, but it is in the research. And what we're going to do with Strudberg is we're not going to change the way that our health varies with age. It just carries on diminishing in the same way. We're just going to increase the chances of living longer. So we're going to raise life expectancy. The area under the gray curve is life expectancy, and it's higher than under the blue curve. And of course, you can see what's happening. You know, as you raise life expectancy more and more, you're getting the extra years in less health. Healthy life expectancy is increasing because, you know, the orange line is positive, it's not negative, but every extra year is giving you less of an increase in healthy life expectancy than every previous year. So there's an expansion of morbidity. We're living longer, but healthy life expectancy is not increasing with life expectancy. Then there's, if you like, the opposite of Strudberg, which is Dorian Gray. In the book Dorian Gray, there's a portrait of Dorian Gray in the attic, which ages. It shows really what's happening to Dorian Gray, but he himself remains young and healthy and fit. So his healthy life expectancy is sort of the same as his life expectancy. So we're going to model that by using the US survival curve, the blue line. But now we're going to look at what happens if we can improve the relationship between health with age. So our health diminishes less slowly, it's maintained for longer. So this is a compression of morbidity. We're increasing healthy life expectancy, we're not changing life expectancy. And of course, because this is a model, we can play around with it and we can look at everything, and we can look at a full compression of morbidity. You know, what would happen if we just make that orange line literally horizontal going all the way across? So we have a full compression of morbidity. Now, you're probably aware of what's happening in geroscience, much excitement about understanding better the biological pathways of aging. And you know, what we've done so far with Strudberg is say, well, I can change the relationship between mortality and age, but not health and age. Or with Dorian Gray, I'm going to change how we age by changing the relationship of health and age, but not mortality. But the geroscience says, well, actually, there's this common pathways of aging, which triggers multiple age-related diseases. And so it's that biological age that leads to rising mortality and diminishing health. And perhaps we can do something to change the rate at which we age biologically. So C. elegans is the worm in the lab that they make live 10 times longer. The naked mole rat has a mortality rate that doesn't fall with age. So there's a lot of work happening. So let's think about how we introduce that into our framework. And that's very simple. We're going to have mortality and health depending on biological age, but we're going to change the relationship between biological and chronological age. We're going to make age malleable, both in terms of health and in terms of mortality. So we're going to change both the survival curve and the health curve. And we're going to do it in one of two ways. So here we've got biological age and chronological age. The blue line shows you the original relationship between them. And the Peter Pan one slows down how you age. So you have the orange line now, so that as you get older chronologically, every birthday cake, your biological age is not increasing as much as it was before. So you just slow down the rate of age. Now, some of the geroscientists are very excited about cellular reprogramming, and they think actually it might be easier to reverse aging than slow down aging. Just it might be easier to wind your watch back. I've just traveled from the UK to the US. It's quite easy to wind my watch back. It's harder to slow down the rate at which the hands move on my watch. So that's about age reversal, very controversial. Will it happen? Loads of issues around it. Luckily, we've got a model. We can make it happen in our model. And what that does is just simply saying, well, at 50, I'm going to reset my biological age through having cellular reprogramming, and now I'm 40 or 30 or whatever. And then we've assumed you just carry on aging as the cells would otherwise until you do another Wolverine. I'm actually not going to go into much detail about Peter Pan and Wolverine, because actually it's surprising how similar they are in terms of our model. And you can sort of see it in this diagram here, because Peter Pan is preferred to Wolverine here. Until I take the Wolverine, then I prefer Wolverine, and then later on I prefer Peter Pan. So there's sort of pluses and minuses. They're actually quite similar if you take them to their extreme. But each of them is saying, what if we tackled biological age so we simultaneously get improvements in health and in mortality? Okay, please don't worry, I'm not going to go through this. This is showing you that because we have a model, we can come up with lots of numbers. But there's a few numbers I do want to just briefly talk about here. This is for Strudberg. And we base ourselves on the then US life expectancy of 78.9, which of course is now significantly less, mainly because of COVID. And we can say, okay, what's the impact of slowing down the increase in mortality so you get one more year of life expectancy? And that's 118.1 thousand is the first number. Then we say, well, that takes you from 78.9 to 79.9. What about another 1 year increase? And that's 114.1. So what you can see here is that things diminish. As you increase with Strudberg, the life expectancy, the gains get less and less, which is understandable because the health is getting less. But the other thing to mention here is if you look at the value of another year of life, it increases with age. The younger you are, the less you value another year increase in life expectancy. And that's really just because it's so far off. It's 80 years away. In economic models, we discount the future. So it's just happening a long way off. Whereas, of course, when I'm 60 or 80 and you're telling me I'm going to improve your life expectancy in your 70s and 80s, that's worth a lot more to me because it's soon. And those two features are going to play a big part in the general results I'm going to go through. Okay, so let me move away from numbers and now try and go a little bit in a higher level. So if we look at the Strudberg case, this is the one where we're just doing kind of really what's been happening, I would say, the last 50, 60 years, getting people living for longer, but not improving necessarily their health at each age. It's valuable. Time is precious, so we like longer lives. I can still, vividly remember being in the hospital bed when my father was dying with my mother, and she holding his hand, and he had motor neuron disease, terrible disease, ALS, and she said, life is sweet. And longer lives are valuable, even if they are in diminishing health in this model. But because health diminishes so much in later years, it's quite a sharp fall in the gains you get from every year. If you compare that with Dorian Gray, which is just increasing healthy life expectancy, but not changing the length of life, then the gains from Dorian Gray are huge. They're just much, much greater. We really, really, really value health. Now, perhaps I don't need to tell you this, but this is what comes out strongly from the model. Health is incredibly important. And in fact, what our model says is that it's more valuable in America right now to get a full compression of morbidity than it is to get further gains in life expectancy. That's how big the gains from healthy life expectancy are from Dorian Gray compared to Strudberg. So Strudberg is sort of where we've been heading the past decades. Dorian Gray is really where we need to be going in future decades. However, the Peter Pan example is really interesting because it reveals what I call a complementarity between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. The better your health, the more you value further increases in life expectancy. But the more life expectancy gets away from healthy life expectancy, the more you value improvements in healthy life expectancy. So in other words, the more progress you make from Strudberg, the more you value Dorian Gray. But the more progress you make with Dorian Gray, the more you value further gains to Strudberg. Put simply, and it's perhaps pretty obvious, when people are not healthy in their 80s, they don't want to live to their 80. But when they're healthy in their 80s, they want to live to their 90s. And that complementarity is what unlocks when you do Peter Pan. Because with Peter Pan, I'm increasing length of life and I'm increasing my health as well. So of course, Peter Pan is therefore more valuable than Dorian Gray because he gets both of those gains, but he gets longer life, but also healthier, longer lives. Now, the other thing to stress, and I'll show you some numbers in a moment, is just how big these gains are. We're talking about trillions of dollars. Now, I hope that doesn't surprise anyone in the room. We know health is crucial to us. We know that as we're living longer, the health burden is about age-related diseases. So not surprisingly, improving how we age has trillions of dollars of benefit. But we'll be able to give some numbers to that. Just to sort of show you, and you can look at the numbers, but I would just look at the scale here. This is comparing the gains from Strudberg, which is the blue line. So this is another year of life expectancy by improving survival rates, but not improving the health function. Compared with Dorian Gray, where you're not increasing life expectancy, but you're improving health at every age and getting one more year of healthy life expectancy. So compressing morbidity. And you can see just how big the gains from compressing morbidity are to just extending life. Truly, 2 or 3 times larger for one more year of healthy life expectancy, holding life expectancy constant, than just raising life expectancy. Now, we've got numbers, we can do any calculation you want. So what we're doing here, this is some international data. So what we can do is we can work out the value of any health intervention in our model at any age. And then of course, we've got population data that tells us the number of people of every age in every country. So we can say, okay, let's imagine in 2022, we do a Peter Pan intervention that slows down aging. And we're going to slow down aging such that life expectancy increases by 1 year, but also we're going to get better health because we're going to have higher health at every age as well. How valuable would that be? And we can calculate that across the whole US population because we've got the age structure of the US population. And also in doing this calculation, we have to factor in future generations who are also going to benefit from this, the people not yet born. So that enables us to say, all right, we can now calculate for the United States, what is the dollar value of improving life expectancy by 1 year by a Peter Pan type intervention that just pushes out the survival rate and raises health at every age, such as sort of, 70 is the new 69, 65 is the new 64 and a bit, that type of intervention. And the bottom right shows you that it's $51 trillion. Now, it's a huge amount of money. As a macroeconomist, we often talk about trillions, so I'm not too astounded by it, but it is an enormous number, 51 trillion. And of course, it's smaller for other countries because they've got smaller populations. And in general, when you do health interventions, you look at the average income to say, well, how much would I spend on these interventions? But basically, 51 trillion is the present value. Now, I never quite know how much to stress that number because, of course, it's huge. And if you go along to a government and say, hey, there's $51 trillion of gains to be had from improving how we age, I hope that grabs people's attention. But it's a big number for lots of reasons. One is that, the value to each of us individually is huge. And of course, there's loads of people in the United States. So it's a huge number. And also that 51 trillion is not the benefit to me just this year. It's the benefit I get, I'm 57, when I'm 57, 58, 59, 60. So it's over my whole lifetime. So perhaps a better way of expressing this number would not be the sort of the whole future stream of benefits, but to work them out on a kind of annual basis. And if you do that, it comes out at about 3 or 4% of GDP a year. In other words, if we could slow down aging to gain 1 more year of life and improve how we age, health at every age, it's the equivalent, worth equivalent of 3 to 4% of GDP every year forever. And the reason, by the way, I like that number is if you think about the COVID interventions, it kind of works out roughly across into countries. You could see that they took measures which lowered GDP and in order to save lives. And actually that 3 to 4% of GDP for every year of life expectancy, it's not a bad guess of what we actually did during the crisis. So, you know, this is just a very precise way of saying health matters. Few things are as important as our health. And as we get older, the most important part of the health burden is age-related diseases. Let me try and move on to some of the other sort of perhaps more interesting things that come out from this analysis rather than just the numbers. And this is sort of where this is just only going to get ever more important. And I want to say this is not about an aging society. This is, for me, about longevity. So the chart on the left tries to do the following. It says, okay, let's look at an individual at birth and work out their willingness to pay for this Peter Pan intervention. But what's changing from 1933 through to 2020 is a survival curve. So in 1933, that newborn had a pretty low chance of making it to 70 or 80. Today, they have a very high chance of making it to 70 or 80. In other words, the willingness to pay for improving how you age increases over time because you're more likely to become old. When 20% of newborns make it to 80, it's not very valuable to think about tackling diseases of aging. But when the majority of newborns will make it through to 80, it then becomes incredibly important. And this to me is just a really, really simple part of what I call the implications of longevity. For the first time ever in human history, the young have a more than 50% chance of becoming the old, and therefore it's never been more important to age well. So this is about what we do over all of life in investing, because if the health burden is increasing about age-related diseases, and the real change is the young will now become the old, we need to put more resources to age well. The other chart on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can recall, I said that actually the gains from living longer or aging better increase with how old you are. So of course, as the average age of society increases, the value of tackling age-related diseases increases. So these two are really important because they feed off one another. It says, back in 1933, the young didn't have much chance of becoming old. There weren't many older people. There wasn't much, the health challenges of age-related diseases were much less. But with this rising probability of becoming old and the increasing number of older people, the gains just get bigger and bigger from aging better. Let me skip those last two slides and come on to this point. There's 4 very interesting dynamics about the gains from aging. And I'd just like to try and sort of get through, because I'm going to come to a point where I think we're at sort of a takeoff point here. So I've said that the willingness to pay rises with age. So as we have more old people, society's willingness to pay for treating age-related diseases increases. I've also said that the better we get at aging, the more we value further increases in aging. That complementarity between health and life expectancy. If I'm ill in my 80s, I don't want to live to my 90s. If I'm well in my 80s, I do want to live into my 90s. The other thing that's interesting about targeting aging itself is that if you could target aging and it affected a multiple number of diseases, you get some other synergies. So what are those? The first is obviously, there are so many diseases that seem to have aging as a risk factor or as a commonality, dementia, cardiovascular disease, etc. So if you could slow down aging, you of course hopefully have an effect across multiple diseases. So of course you'd expect targeting aging to have a much bigger value than just targeting single diseases. But there's another spillover, which is that, if we could make even further progress in reducing cancer, the gains are still limited because there's still the risk of dementia, etc., which affects the quality of life. But if you could slow down aging and affect the incidence of all of those diseases, then the quality of life is higher because you've improved health at those ages in a more substantial way. So because of that aggregation, I'm summing across more diseases. And because of the improvement in the quality of life, because I've reduced multiple diseases, these gains from aging are very, very large. And then the final one is simply that as we get better at aging, there are more old people. And therefore, the population's larger and the average age is larger. So there's greater gains from aging. Now, those four, I know it's hard, but those four, there's a sort of a dynamic pattern here. And that dynamic pattern gives us this virtuous circle. The better we get at aging, the more we want to age better, but the better we age, the more we value further gains to aging. And I think this is something quite unique to aging. If you think about, when the major disease burden in society was infant mortality, tackling infant mortality is the most important thing to do. But as you make progress in reducing infant mortality, then you start to focus on the diseases of midlife. But as you start to make progress in the diseases of midlife, you start to focus on the diseases related to age-related diseases. But what this says is that actually, unlike infant mortality or midlife, the better you get at trying to age, the more you're going to value further improvements. So this is just something that is going to become ever more important, the better that we get at it. And that, I think, is quite a remarkable change compared to past disease challenges. So let me try and zoom in. And of course, the irony of talking about longer lives is I always run out of time. But let me try and sort of just pull together a few of the simple notions of what I've been talking about. And forgive me if I've been ambitious in this 40 minutes. So really, we want to call the paper All's Well That Ages Well, because if you look at the changes in the survival rate, the young and middle age are now likely to become old. Health deteriorates with age. So the most important thing is to take steps now to improve how you age. Now, I focused on, this sort of miraculous shift in the health function or the survival curve, and I made reference to geroscience. But as you know much better than I, how we age isn't just about our health. It's about our finances, it's our skills, engagement, relationships, sense of purpose. And investing in all of those will improve how we age. So that's kind of a message across the board. If we now have a greater probability of becoming old, we have to invest in that, make sure that we age better across all those dimensions. The aging society tends to focus on end of life. Longevity says actually it's about all of life. Aging is recursive. What I can give myself in my 50s is going to benefit what I can give myself in my 60s, etc. That, of course, means this isn't just about the rich countries with currently very old population, but also lower and middle income countries who may have an average age of population quite low, but it will see that age increase over time. They've got to make sure that the future old, who are the current young, age as well as possible. But I also think we're shifting into what Geroscience calls a new epidemiological transition. And as I try to explain, I think this is a different one because the dynamics of this model just says, as I live longer, I put a higher probability on diseases that occur in later life. The more I extend that, the more I'm going to value further gains. So this is just something where I think we're going to see ever more resources putting into what I call the evergreen agenda of how do we age well. That seems a fundamental change for humanity. We've now got more and more people living into 80s and 90s, and that seems something new. So we have a new health and social imperative to age well. Gains to healthy aging are enormous. Achieving a three-dimensional longevity dividend is key, but this is a topic that will just rise in importance, and not just because of the aging society and more old people, but it's more about this rising probability of the young becoming old. And I should probably stop there. So thank you very much for your patience and your time. And I'd love to have a conversation.
That was fantastic. And do you have well, I have to look in the chat for questions, and please submit any questions you have in the chat. So I look at the longer and the healthier, the first two dimensions, and I see patterns to attack. Help me understand what you mean by making the productive part of the three dimensions equally as strong.
So the easiest thing for me to answer that question is in a narrow economic way, which just says, if you're living for longer, you've got to create more resources to finance that lifetime. And that's about working for longer. And it's hard to finesse that. So, for me, that's about how we maintain health, which of course is key, because we know that people who don't work in their 50s are not going to start working in their 60s. It's about skills and lifelong learning, but also about creating a work environment where there's less ageism, but also more of those age-friendly jobs that I was referring to earlier. And of course, I very much talked about averages here, but both the US and UK have got terrible inequality in these areas. And really tackling those inequalities are a key part of it. But that's the simplest way, which is how do we create more resources to finance a longer life? Because if you're living for longer, it's hard to get away from. You're either going to work for longer or you're going to spend less every year. So we do need to work for longer. But I think it's more than that as well. It's that point. I run a thing called the Longevity Forum. I did a podcast with Tom Kirkwood recently, who's such an interesting man. And he has this line he reused repeatedly in the interview, which is society has continually underestimated the capacity of older people. Mm-hmm. And I think that productive one I'll fit there as well, because it's not just about working. It's also just about providing care and support to your family, to your neighborhood, to society, and just a sense of involvement and engagement. So I would broaden it out to include that as well.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so a question from Shana Gleason, which is, how do you anticipate climate change will intersect with these projections?
Yeah, no, the trouble with these big trends, there's so many things to look at. If we're going to work for longer, what about technology? And will we have jobs to work? And then, of course, there's the environment. So, let me give us a few quick answers to that. The first is, of course, in its most extreme form, climate change is an existential risk, which means all these life expectancy statistics are nonsense. Because if we have the world blowing up, destroying itself, then of course this isn't going to happen. It's also, of course, going to be the case that we'll see a shift in diseases. It will depend, which country you live in, but we're clearly going to see a shift in disease burdens as temperature rises, and some. In the UK, fewer people will die of cold, but more will die of heat. So there'll be sort of some shifts of that form. But I would actually go back and say, I think the two are completely compatible, which is that we know that things like environmental pollution are bad for our health. We know that certain types of farming and food we eat are bad for our health and bad for the environment. So actually, there's not a conflict here. I think they both go very well together. And then I just add one final thing, which may be a little bit wildly optimistic. And I can, sometimes I can be optimistic, although I'm an economist, I'm a dismal scientist. There's the book, The Leopard, the Italian book, The Leopard, where I think the count says something like, I only care for those that I will meet in my life. And I think, if we're going to make the most of longer lives, we have to start thinking longer term. And so, that's kind of the same sort of challenge with sustainability. But I don't want to minimize the sustainability challenge. And let me just finish one more point on that. Part of the sustainability challenge is about overpopulation. And of course, if you have more people living longer, the population will be larger. I think that's quite a small effect. But I also think the real problem we have at the moment is not so much the number of people, we just have an unsustainable lifestyle. And with an unsustainable lifestyle, whether you've got 8 billion or 6 billion, eventually things go wrong. So we have to have a sustainable lifestyle. So hopefully the two go together.
Thank you. That was not the answer that I expected. I really have never met. No, I think that it actually goes to the productivity part of the thing, is that my impression is that a lot of older people have thought about climate change as not their problem. And what I think now, as part of the awakening that you're describing, is it's very much their problem.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with that too. And one of the big things it sort of does worry me, it's very hard. I mean, this point about this new part of human existence where the young can now have a 50%, more than 50% chance of becoming the old or very old, is a very fundamental change in human culture. And to think about changing how we age goes against all sorts of stereotypes or cultures we've got. But it also does involve thinking long term. And I don't know about you, I'm not great at thinking long term. And I think how we think long term is going to be a key muscle. And of course, that is the common challenge for both longevity and the environment. And just to echo Shelley's point, forgive me, I know when I do the maths, I always think of things deteriorating, but I completely agree about not talking about it as deterioration. It's about maintaining health.
Stephen Fogel has his hand up. Steve, you want to unmute yourself and just ask away?
Yes, please. Thanks, George. If it's cool, I'll see if I can do this video too. Hi, Andrew, thank you for the presentation. I just have a question. The number, the $50 trillion that you were not sure about how you were stressing. I'm not an economist. I'm kind of over in the religion, spirituality, and aging side of this whole endeavor.
That's a long way from 50 trillion.
Say again?
That's a long way from 50 trillion.
Depends on how value the capital assets. But anyway, the question then is that 50 trillion, is that if we're investing in the Peter Pan model, so you're saying that we'll have those kind of gains? Is that did I understand? So then my question is what kind of concrete policy, these numbers are based on the US projections. So are you suggesting that if the United States were to invest in, say, the care economy, or to Shana's point about the climate change and infrastructure that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act or the Build Back Better, all of those, are you saying that those are practical steps that, per your modeling, investing in longevity and reduction of morbidity, so the Peter Pan model, like the numbers check out? Is that kind of what you're saying? Thank you.
Not quite. I mean, I wouldn't want to say, I'm not sure they answer that question rather than they say yes or no to that question. So one of the challenges I think we've got is we don't, I would say as an economist, understand enough how changes in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy at older years benefit the economy. What I think is so interesting is that when I talk to governments in lower income countries, there's a starting point that health and education for the young are good for the economy. But then when I go and talk to ministries of finance in higher income countries, they kind of just hand over a check to the health department, say, spend it on aging, and they don't expect anything out of it. And I think we need to think about health and education spend as not just a positive in its own right, but positive for the economy. But we haven't kind of even got the models or the data or theory to work out about what that would be. So what I've done in this is say, well, okay, subject to haven't got reliable models for that yet. I could put a finger in the air, but I haven't got a reliable model. How do I just put a value on health gains? So I go back to sort of, and I know it's always controversial, the COVID example, but certain economists were saying, what's the trade-off? If we save lives and we lose GDP, is it worth it? And they would say yes, because health is incredibly valuable to us. So it's really not so much that the economy booms because we spend this money. It's simply that what is most valuable to us? Health. And that health improvement is worth 50 trillion to us. How we pay for it is another matter, where the income comes from. but it is saying this is the scale of the gains from aging well.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Great. So we had one more question. What about the future resources available and the longevity phenomenon added to the increased population? This was your sustainability point.
Yeah. No, so I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues here around falling fertility rates, and fertility rates are very, very low in lots of countries now, and they're kind of below replacement rate, and I worry about that. So as I say, I think if we can get a sustainable lifestyle, we can support a large population, and that would be my preference. But also, if you could do the sort of demographic projections, unless you're talking about wild increases in life expectancy, like going to 300, 400, 500, you don't actually see that big an increase in the population from people living longer. It's the fertility rate that's the really big driver of the population growth. And given what's happening to that at the moment, I think we will, we're already seeing many countries where population is declining. We might well see that occurring, quite soon at a global level as well. But so none of this is to minimize the need to worry about resources. I just think it's not a reason to say we shouldn't help people live longer. I think we need to do both at the same time. And really what, that 50 trillion number says is this stuff should be up there with the environment in terms of how important it is.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I have right up 12:30. I just really want to thank you. This was very thought-provoking. Certainly my reason for submitting grants focused on geroscience will have a little bit healthier and heartier justification from now on. And for all of us, I just want to say thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Jules. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.